All right, greetings everyone. This is Sentinal Apologietics, so your one and only General Han Solo, along with a panel. Uh, so Hunter, Hound, Emily, Shmika, and our guest Steve McRae. This discussion and Q&A, and yeah, it's pretty much like a impromptu, you know, gathering of minds here. So Steve McRae is actually a good friend of mine. He's I guess you could say you're an atheist now, Steve.
No,
Yeah.
I'm still
Are you
agnostic.
still okay? But yeah, I would like to first introduce Steve and his podcast called the NonSequitur Show. It's on YouTube, but I've also linked in the video description. I've linked um, the website nonsequitur.com. And yeah, Steve, maybe you can explain to us why your show is significant and what's new about it and why you went along in developing it with your friend of yours, which I guess you can mention his name as well.
Kyle
And
Curtis.
right, and what shows you have had so far, and what's been the most significant show thus to date, and yeah, so
Sure,
go
I'd
ahead.
love to. The Not Sequitur Show was a project that Kyle Curtis and I started thinking about quite some time ago. It was an extension of the Great Debate Community, which is a community on G Plus that I own that has a group of laypersons and experts that get together to talk about various topics such as theology, philosophy, science, things of that nature. And the Non Sequitur Show was kind of developed to have honest dialogue between people with different opinions in a way that fostered an actual conversation, an actual dialectic. We try to avoid things like empty rhetoric. We try to avoid things that lead to the conversation degrading. Now, that obviously isn't always possible. There are some times we're just going to have, you know, a show that is so one sided, like the Aaron Raw and Ken Hovind discussion, which just over a month has well over 100, I think 10,000 views. That obviously is not going to go great because you're dealing with a position of dishonesty, I think, because as people know, I've been on YouTube for quite some time and my position is very strong. I'm against younger creationism. I'm against flat earth. And so I don't leave that at the table when I have a show. I still have those beliefs that those things are completely untrue. But I try to give a much uh, neutral platform to somebody if they're going to give a decent argumentation. So if somebody comes in and they have a differing opinion, if they at least have a good argument, then we have a great discussion. But if they just come in and their whole thing is conspiratorial in nature, or it's just one of those Sci 10, how do you know things? I don't really bother with it. But anyways, the Non Sequitur Show is been about 3 months old. We have about 5,000 subs now. We're on track to hit 10,000 by I think next month. And we have had amazing guests on, like Dr. Herman Mays. We've have Richard Carrier, Dr. Rich Carrier. We have so much more in store. We've got Matt Dillahunty coming up on the 24th. And we actually have even bigger guests than him planned, but we haven't confirmed a date yet. So I'll just leave that as a teaser. But by the way, I'm thrilled to death to be on your show today, Sentinel Apologetics. You have a great channel. I do follow it, even though I don't understand half of it, but I do follow it. So thank you very much for inviting me on today to talk a little bit about atheism and theism and the conversation between people that obviously have very different ideological beliefs.
Right, right. And also let me just put this out there that um, when I saw the non sequitur show, the beginnings of it, I noticed. Okay, let me just preface this a little bit. So I've known Steve since probably the end of 2015, and Steve was part of. He was the head, so to speak. He was the brain behind the Great Debate community. Gathering like-minded, intelligent people to get together, and back in those days we had Dr. Hugh Ross from Reasons to Believe, who, after his interaction with Steve and the group, actually continued to uh, remind people in his own audience and in his own context that he called it an internet TV sort of show that intelligent people from around the world can get together and have a dialogue and I guess with the Christian intellectuals that joined on the panel, um, we wanted to try and model how of setting aside biases and beliefs and so on, how we can have intellectual dialogues, specifically aiming at a scholarly context. And that was the aim originally. And I think, Steve, after after maybe about 2 years, I think it is, since I've known you, you went straight for it and said, "Hey, why don't we just have a show?" Which, if you think about it, most of the shows like on YouTube, like those atheist shows on YouTube from um, the what are those other
Atheist
shows called?
Express.
The Atheist Experience or
Mhm.
something, and there's another one. Most of them have actually, I don't know, they seem to have just died off. They've just distilled away, and so non-sequitur shows a breath of fresh air, in my opinion, because there's a lot of familiar faces, like Aaron Ra came on. Obviously, Ken Hovind came on. But the point is that it's fresh. There's at the same time new voices. Um, you're wanting that interaction, that intelligent interaction between Christians and non-Christians, and I think that's that should be commended. So yeah,
Thank you,
that's
because that has been our goal from day one. We want to provide a platform for people to talk and people to be entertained. Clearly, when you're on YouTube, the end goal is to have people watch. You're not on YouTube just to express yourself. You want people to actually listen to you and agree or disagree. That's the whole point, I think, of these types of channels. And the Non Sequitur show has a little bit of both. I mean, we have people that comment to us all the time. They agree with us, or they don't agree with us. Each one of those comments is valued.
right. Okay, now there was something else you wanted to discuss specifically about your epistemological position, I think, where you you're aiming more towards the atheist side, and maybe you can flesh that out as to why, and what have you
Sure.
been wrestling with and so on.
Well, let me just clarify my terms so people that watch this video afterwards, they they understand the reasoning that I'm using here. Because when I'm using the word atheism, I personally am using the formal definitions, the sensu stricto or sensu strictissimo definitions, which is a belief that God does not exist, or more specifically, I use it as the belief that the proposition of theism is false. So I take it propositionally. So when I'm using the word atheism, most of the time I'm using it as a propositional thing. Hang on, excuse me. So when I mean propositionally, if I say the proposition at least one God exists, I am assigning the atheism as the position that proposition is false. But there's also the psychological belief, the ontology that gods don't exist, right? And that's okay too. I can use it somewhat interchangeably with that. I'm not using it as like American atheists would use it. I'm not using it as um, atheist experience would use it. They're using it as anybody who doesn't believe in God. I do not use the word atheist that way. If they wish to, more power to them. That's fine. That's a colloquial definition. So great. But I do want to make sure that people understand for this discussion, when I use the term atheism, I'm using the very formal definitions. And also the word belief, when I use the word belief, I'm talking about the belief that the proposition is true or not. Not so much the belief as in I have faith in something. And if I use the word faith, I'm using confidence, not the way a religious person would use it, because it's a well-defined thing in religion what faith means, right? Things that you have faith for that yet unseen. I don't know, remember the biblical passage, but I don't
Right.
use the word faith that way, right? If I say I have faith in somebody, that means I have a confidence in them. So I don't want anybody to have any kind of equivocation issues here. So anyway, so my position on the proposition of theism is that I take a position that I can't assign a truth value to it. I'm an agnostic. I don't know how to properly evaluate that proposition, if it's true or false. And if it's true, then you would be a theist. If it's false, you'd be an atheist. I suspend judgment on it. So I look at the proposition and I say, I at this moment cannot give you what I believe. I can't say I believe God exists, and I can't say I believe God does not exist. I am suspending judgment on it. Now, granted, ontologically, existentially, God exists or he does not exist. That's a complete fact. That's a dichotomy. But the belief on that are not dichotomous. And so I hold the position that I don't have a belief either way. So like the lack of belief atheist, or the weak atheist who says, I don't believe the theist, I too don't believe the theist. I just go one step further and say, I also don't believe the atheist. And again, the atheist being the positive assertion that God does not exist. I don't believe either one of them. I don't have a God belief, and I don't have a belief that God does not exist. But recently, I've been seeing a lot of increase in this rhetoric from both sides, both from theist and atheist. So I'm not saying that atheists don't have rhetoric. They most certainly do. But I have seen theists disproportionately have the rhetoric, and far more egregious. When I see people that are theists that are just making the most ridiculous arguments and sounding, I hate to use the word insane, but they do use some pretty insane arguments. And it just turns me away from it. When if I'm looking to evaluate their proposition and I want to have evidence either way to evaluate, and I see Christians just being extremely sophistic and not in a good way, or just empty rhetoric, it tends to turn me away from that. And when I see an atheist, like last night, we had Dr. Stephen McRae on, very, very good biblical scholar. He's an atheist, but he made some very cogent points, and he made some very cogent points towards the contradictions in the Bible and why there's contradictions in the Bible and how many people wrote the Bible and the narrative of the Bible. And as soon as you start taking apart the Bible and saying, okay, I don't accept Noah's Ark. I believe Noah's Ark didn't happen. Absolutely not. It's just completely impossible. I think most people probably even here agree that the whole story of Noah's Ark is just bunk. Evolution obviously exists. And obviously you couldn't get the amount of extant species we have today from the biblical narrative of that. And on the whole, like man being swallowed by a whale, again, I don't believe that, or I believe that's not true. And so when I start looking at the Bible and I start looking and going, okay, well, I believe that's not true. And I believe that's not true. And I believe that's not true. And Genesis, yeah, I don't believe that either. Where do you go from there? What part of the Bible's left where you can say, okay, I believe that the Yahweh is still a being that's even in the realm of possibility to have a discussion with, right? Now, I don't accept certain variations of Yahweh. Uh-oh. Did General get knocked out? Did you guys still there?
Looks like it.
I saw that he froze. I will see if he comes back in, because I'm just going to go off air in a few minutes. So I don't accept certain narratives of Yahweh, like this young earth creationist God. That God does not exist. I'm flat out no, that particular God does not exist. And I can say I have knowledge of that because I have an epistemic framework that allows me to. And I have evidence that allows me to say that God, that particular version of God, does not exist. But there are other versions, like the concordance approach, I find interesting. I don't agree with it, but I find it interesting. So I kind of want to have this discussion with you all who are theists. What type of deity do you posit that would make me go, okay, I'm still evaluating the proposition? Because I'm not saying that I moved into atheism. That's nothing like that. I'm still agnostic. But I do think that at the moment, good atheist arguments are superseding good theist arguments. Does that make sense? By the way, I can't. You're hidden from broadcasting, Hunter, and I can't unhide you. Yeah, so they won't be able to hear you. And I want to clarify here when I mean agnosticism. Agnosticism, contrary to what you hear on the YouTubers and things of that nature, agnosticism is not a knowledge position. I don't care how many times people repeat it, how many times it does a 3 men and a tiger, which is you hear something enough and it becomes dogma and doctrine. Agnosticism, as generally used in philosophical literature, is the state of being agnostic on a proposition. It has nothing to do with knowledge. What it has to do is the inability to give a true or false value to a proposition. And so whether I know or not God exists makes no difference. Agnosticism, as I'm using it, as it's generally understood to be used in philosophy, is a belief position that you cannot properly evaluate that proposition and you suspend judgment on it. So that's when I'm using the term agnosticism, that is how I'm particularly using it. It makes no difference whether we can know God exists or not. That's where my modifier, my epistemic modifier comes in. I'm a temporal agnostic, meaning that temporally, I personally believe that nobody has the knowledge of God's exist or not. But I don't think it's impossible to know one way or another. A Huxleyan agnostic would say it is impossible. They would say that knowledge one way or another is impossible to know if God exists or not. I don't take that strong of approach, but I understand it. By the way, welcome back, General. I carried on without you.
Sorry, I had a power outage, so yeah. Anyway,
quite all right. Welcome. I'm just glad you came back before we went off air.
Yeah.
I think you missed the vast majority of my rant there.
I think I was kind of grasping more or less your argument in a nutshell, in a broad stroke sort of thing. So, um, do you believe that the Christian message of faith, to have faith, even when Jesus says trust in God, uh, literally in the Greek trust, but it can be translated have faith in God, um, that it is a method of an emotional response rather than an intellectual response. Is that something that you gather from the scripture? Do you think that's what the Christian faith is about? Um, or is there some form of like dry intellectual rigor as to why then you should trust this God and no other God and all that?
Well, I understand. Okay, again, so you're changing the word faith a little bit.
Okay.
The way and it's not, you're not equivocating. You're using it your own way. I just want for clarification. You're using faith to mean, things that are hoped for that are not, seen kind of approach. And I understand the fetus position. I do disagree a little bit about this with certain people that they think fetism is a very dishonest approach, or at least not an honest one. And I get that. And I think there's an argument to be made for that about fetism. But I'd rather have that than somebody who believes something with absolutely no warrant whatsoever. At least they say, I take it on faith. I get that. But I don't necessarily understand the need for faith when there's just not a lot of supporting evidence to support that faith. And there's a lot of contradictions and a lot of evidence against having that faith. Even when I was a theist, and for those who know my history, I was baptized Mormon when I was 17, and people can argue, well, that's Mormon, it's not Christian, whatever. I think they're an idiots. Mormons are Christians, just like Catholics are Christian. These are all Christian denominations. But I never really felt that I had a connection to any being called Christ. Now, granted, I did have what I thought was a spiritual experience, with the Holy Ghost. And I still can't explain it to this day. I don't know. But I've had many weird experiences I can't explain. But that can only get me at best, even if those things were experiential, to some kind of non-ontological naturalism. Because I'm not an ontological naturalist. I only hold to methodological naturalism. So I believe the possibility does exist, but then it runs into the problem, what does it even mean to be non-natural? What is supernatural? I mean, I could make a set of things and say, okay, this goes in the set of what I would say would be supernatural. Extensionally, I can say, okay, I'd put ghost in the set, I'd put God in this set. Okay, fair enough. But if I had an intentional set, which means like the set of all things that say, okay, all these are, the set of all supernatural things, I don't know how that would be defined. I have a really hard time defining that, right? What does it mean to be God, to be supernatural? So to answer your question a little more succinctly, I don't know what it means to have faith. Faith. Why would God just want me to have faith that He believes? For what purpose? Why would there be a narrative of that? Why wouldn't He just, hey, I exist? I've shown myself to other people. The whole argument from divine hiddenness, the non-resistant non-believer. You're the kind of, you look down and say, hey, you're the person I want you to know that I exist. How come He doesn't do that? That makes sense?
Right. Right. Um, okay. How would you understand it if I said, or how would you respond based on what you just said? Which, by the way, I sympathize with that last statement of yours, that if God genuinely exists, then this notion of kind of like a dictatorship, like He needs to prove Himself, sort of thing, that you need to have this faith, like believe in me. I mean, if God exists, this notion of this is the steps that you have to have in order to have some form of relationship with Him, that now you believe in me. But hang on a second, you already exist, so why is this faith needed? And I think
Right. Right.
that's
If
a good.
he exists, then why is there a need for faith? And why
Yeah.
would He lead me to a faith that most standard Christians would think is one of the more obscure faiths, like Mormonism? And on the record, I don't agree with Mormonism any longer. Multiple different reasons. Although I love the people, love Mormon people. They're the most friendliest people I've ever had interactions with. And I understand everybody has their own interactions with people, but personally, I think they're very, very wonderful people. But if God wanted me to have faith that He exists, and back then when I was a theist and believed that He exists, when I joined the Mormon Church, But then most Christians would say, well, that's not, a real church, that, Mormonism's fake, false, whatever. But why would he go that route? To what end? The whole narrative makes no sense to me. And years later, now that I'm able to have a better epistemic framework, a better grasp, a little bit of basic philosophy, a better grasp of argumentation theory, I just can't see, saying any longer that why theism would be, for me particularly, a valid position. Now, for others, fine. I mean, a person, a theist, again, I want to make it very clear. I think theism is a very rational position if somebody can meet their burden of justification to make it rational to themselves. And then what I mean by that, they meet their epistemic justification, not their evidential. So if you say, I believe God exists, and you have reasons to believe it that are sound, then then you have a rational basis for it. I mean, if not, you're saying that every theist throughout history was irrational. And I don't believe that. I think rationality changes over time based upon our zeitgeist, our base of knowledge at the time. For us, what is rational now may be irrational 100 years from now, right? But if people are 1,000 years ago, if they had a well-formulated way to formulate a conclusion, then I think they're rational to do so. But they may be wrong. Rationality doesn't mean that you have to be right. Rationality is how you come to a conclusion, right?
So. Right.
Boy, I'm getting outnumbered in here. What is this? I mean, the lion's dead. Help me.
When you put the link out.
Okay.
Hi,
Wayne, my friend.
At least you're in good company, though, because most of these people.
Oh, yeah. I love Wayne. I love Hunter. We obviously go way back.
Yeah, I find those points interesting. So that means, in this sense, faith. There's a certain nuance to faith. The word faith, or in this case, belief, and your choices and what you think and how you behave. Basically, ultimately you're discussing the psychology of a human being and his operation in this life, I guess, like how his modus operandi, so to speak. Like, I mean, if you want,
that's the only thing I have to go for. I'm the only thing that I have to go from to judge that, right? My modus operandi is all that I'm human. I have psychology that I have to go by.
Right. So, from what I've been able to understand, so I'm speaking as an ex-atheist, and I've come into the Christian faith about 9 years ago, at the age of 21, and I did not understand this back then, but I can say now, as I progressed in this thing called Christianity, and understanding the theology behind it and researching it and so on, I've come to realize that this notion of having faith is more about your loyalty to this particular deity, rather than that I'm going to make him smile and have his approval by just saying I do, or like saying the Shahada, like if you're a Muslim, say these words, that Allah, there's no one else but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. That sort of statement, that only then God will approve you into this fold of fellowship and so on. So I've come to see that Christianity is not exactly that. It's more about by default, God exists and he's done this in Jesus. And are you going to join in and be loyal to that message and that reality, so to speak? Whether you like it or not, that's basically Paul's argument. Whether you like it or not, it's already happened, and are you going to join in on that? So if that was offered to you, say if you in dialogue with Paul himself, and he said, I understand, Steve, that if you're talking about epistemic limits and so on, that this notion of having blind faith and so on, that you're being honest to yourself. If you don't have the evidence, then why should you have faith? And I think Paul would agree with you on that. But if he were to ask you the question, well, here's some data for now that can be of benefit to you in order to quote unquote believe, but more so, what about your loyalty? Like, now that you have enough evidence, would you have an association with Jesus? Would you then equate
what would be the benefit?
So the benefit would be in this case your relationship with him in light of the fact that he's forgiven your sins and
But I don't
in
have
from
any. I
after
don't
death.
have any evaluation of that. Even when I was a theist, I never felt a connection to Jesus. I never felt that. Oh yeah, Jesus exists. I had no idea. I still have this no idea whether the man himself even existed. I tend to believe that he
Right.
existed. I am not a mythicist. I think that he probably did. I think there was a narrative that was surrounding him. That's why you have so many different things in the Gospels. You have the Gnostic Gospels, and you have the what do they call the Synoptic Gospels,
Right.
and then you have the one-off John, I think it is, right? That is completely different. I think people have their own narrative, but I don't know what it would even mean when people say I have this personal connection to Jesus. And when I ask them about it, they're never able to articulate it in a way that makes sense.
Right. Right. So, uh, okay, let me word it this way, because what I'm doing is I'm trying to share with you my thought process in this as to why I continue to believe. And I can sympathize with you that when I started to believe, and we're talking maybe a year into the faith, as far as my quote unquote subjective experiences I've had with God were few and far, and they continue to be that way. I can say, but no, this I'm sure you've heard this many times, that I can't prove to you about certain experiences and coincidences I have had, but I'm not going to use that as a model of justification to say this is why you should believe.
No, but you
I
could
think
use those for yourself. I think personal
right,
experience is a very valid method to have justification if it has checks and balances, right?
right,
The senses can be fooled, but I think that a rational person does a cross check with their senses with other things to say, okay, is this really what's going on? Is this really a position that I hold, a belief that I hold? Is it soundly formed? Is it brought about by actual evidence, whether it be empirical or be rational, whatever the reason you hold a particular belief? If I'm arriving to it from a well formulated cognitive process, I go by
hmm
like reliably produced true belief, right? If I have a reliably
right,
produced true belief from a cognitive thought process that I think is reliable, I'm going to call that knowledge, and I'm okay with that.
yeah.
I think beliefs are very
So
similar, obviously.
to give you an example, because you and I are both in the sciences, so for example, relativity, like say special theory relativity. Um, Back when it was first proposed, which even before Einstein, you have Lorentz and his mathematics going to non-Euclidean math, and there's notions of this idea floating around. And then finally, when they see the eclipse and they see the shifting of the positions of the stars, and they're like, "Wow, yeah, light bends,
That
and
was for general
gravity."
relativity, Mr. Physicist, not special.
Sorry, yeah, general relativity.
I
I mean,
corrected a
general relativity
physicist.
is an
That's okay.
offshoot. It comes from special, but
Special
um,
was first, actually. Yes,
right
1908, I believe.
around there, yeah. And I think it was what 1920s was
I thought
GR, and
1914 was he first started formulating, but it's somewhere around there. But anyways, yeah. But
anyway,
the aberration of the star is general relativity, such that we notice the
yes,
apparent position
yeah,
from the actual position.
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah. So now on paper, um, you can make a lot of really good mathematical arguments. Um, I mean, I've seen quite a few, and it's just, yeah, like some are proposed to be this and that. For example, with Einstein, at least it was a development all the way going back from Newton onwards, then Lorentz and his non-Euclidean math, and then leading to Einstein. Um, Now, as a model, as a theoretical model, if that was given to you and you had no concept of this, but you say you can understand the math, and it was given to you, and then you'd go, yeah, that's an interesting proposition, but I need some form of physical evidence for this sort of thing. And sure enough, for the last 100 years, literally pretty much a century of science experiments, now the latest, being with black hole merge events and so on, that general relativity has been proven to like 10 places of a decimal, and it's just a fantastic, it's a
I don't use
verified.
the word proof in science, but it's been demonstrated to, several sigma. several signals.
Oh yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
But I never say we prove anything in science, because science is always changing, and all scientific facts are tentative, they're provisional, and I do feel very strongly that to be a very sound scientific theory, you need falsificationism. You need some kind of falsification in order to say, okay, this theory can be, falsified, and if that's the case, then it can never be proven, because once you've proven something, you cannot disprove it. You can find error in the proof, but a proof is a proof is a proof. It as you know, as a math guy, if something is proven, it's done. It's game over. It is the way it is.
QED.
QED, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, but I'm part of the club. I think it's a minority club that they call it the law of general relativity, meaning it's like it's set in stone sort of thing. But I mean that's because of the precision at which it's been able to be demonstrated.
Oh, absolutely. I think
I completely agree with.
I think general relativity is the second most established scientific theory there is, next to evolution. I think evolution. It is a hell of a lot easier to try to falsify relativity, either or, general special, than it would be evolution. That's my position by far.
Yeah, I've heard that before, and I agree. Yeah. Okay, so you have this theoretical model. Now, after the fact, or maybe before, let's put it this way, maybe before any form of experiments are done to demonstrate it. If we're just speaking as pure math nerds here, you and I could have some form of subjective, like euphoric feeling about, oh, just look how beautiful this math actually looks like, and then that's all it is. It's just that's the experience. But once you actually see it in play, in a dry way, then the fact is that, yeah, here's the data points that you can't ignore, and then afterwards, maybe again you can start to have some form of like spiritual moment, I guess, with respect
Well, I mean,
to
I've had spiritual moments, but again, that doesn't get you to God. That only gets you to, oh, this is pretty cool, or maybe possibly there's something out there more that we don't understand. I don't see anything that actually gets you to God, and I'm not an evidentialist. I mean, I reject Clifford's principle, and people may know by now I'm a non-evidentialist. I think that you can justify personal beliefs many different ways, not just by empiricism. I think you can do it prudentially or pragmatically, but I'm not like Aaron Ra, where Aaron Ra is very fastidious, evidence, and I understand that from a scientific point of view. Aaron's completely right, but my argument is more, these are not scientific arguments, these are philosophical arguments. And existential is literally metaphysics, which is part of philosophy. And I'm not looking for physical evidence. I think anybody says, prove to me God exists or prove to me God does not exist, doesn't understand the arguments, because that's not what you need to go into a conversation asking for. You don't ask.
Let's just say you were walking the streets along with Jesus actually doing the miracles there. Would we even be having this type of discussion?
Well, yeah, probably not. That would work, but I'm not even looking for that. I'm still looking for a reason that why would it even make sense to accept Jesus. And obviously, the weird thing is I do tend to be thinking that doxastic involuntarism is the case, meaning that I don't particularly choose my beliefs. I think that beliefs kind of, in a way, choose us in a metaphorical, heuristic type of approach. But I don't think that I can change my belief on a dime and say, you know what, I really want to believe Jesus is the Son of God today. I don't think that even God would look at somebody and go, yeah, you know what, I believe you. No, they can tell if somebody's faking that, right? So I need my brain state to be changed to say, okay, I now believe Jesus exists and Jesus is the Son of God and all that. And I don't quite see reasoning for why the narrative is for Jesus to exist. If so many other things in the Bible I don't accept. I mean, clearly, everybody here, and I especially know a couple of the people here, they don't accept the young Earth creationist narrative, even though they were young Earth creationists. But they subsequently have gone, okay, look at, I know that's complete nonsense. I know the Earth is not flat. I know the Earth is not created in 7 days. It's clearly science has demonstrated that to be the case beyond reproach. So where then do you stop? Where then do you say, okay, here's a part of the Bible that is not metaphorical. This is a part of the Bible that's not allegorical. This part of the story of Jesus' resurrection is fact. Because when I hear a theist and I hear it quite often. I just watched a video on the other day. My friend Vice Rhino, great channel. He had a video that I was watching about 5 arguments for God, and I thought all the 5 arguments that were narrated were very poor arguments. Make the argument of the empty tomb. Sorry, it's not a great argument to me. You know, I mean, tomb was empty. Okay, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Maybe he was buried, put there. Maybe he wasn't.
Yeah,
Well,
but do you see?
that's not a real argument.
Right, but do you see how those blanket statements in itself um, are nothing but a summary of an amalgamation of data that's part of what the Christians call the kerygma. That when you start to flesh out, so for example, and I've seen you interview Richard Carrier, and I've seen Richard Carrier, talk on 1 Corinthians 15, the first couple of verses that
Mm-hmm.
form this thing called the kerygma, the statement that according to the scriptures he was buried and he rose again on the third day. That so this notion of an empty tomb, that statement alone then fleshes out. If you were to reverse engineer that statement out back into, we're talking literally tens of thousands of pages of dialogue and data points that then confirm what the statement actually is saying. So therefore, the reading and I guess the research, which I think you've asked me this a year or two ago, that general, in order to believe, I have to do all this reading and research, and you've asked me that question. And I think that's ultimately what one has to do in order to then go from an evidential, perspective.
I asked that even before we started. I said, if you have to spend so many years of your life understanding how to read Greek so you can understand the Septuagint, or Hebrew so you can understand the Hebrew Bible, and
Yeah.
get a PhD in biblical
And I saw you
studies.
interviewed that Bible scholar as well, the atheist.
He was great. Yeah, he was great. Richard
yeah.
was great too. Really nice guy.
Yeah.
But again, that's just so much effort. And then you still have people that have diametrically opposite opinions. I mean, Dr. McRae last night, he obviously, is an atheist. He believes God does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's come to a different position based on his studies, just like Richard Carrier has, than he would have from some, like Michael Eisner, who obviously, would come to a different position.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you have all this vast knowledge, you're still not going to, what good is it going to do you? You still are really bringing your own, personal bias to the conversation in some ways. Now, I don't think Stephen did last night. I think that he actually really does try to make an objective argument. I think he really does a good job of that. But if you're a theist, you're automatically going into the discussion, and this is fine, that the Bible is true in some parts, that there is a God, Jesus was the son of a God, and you could pick it apart one way or another and say this part's true, this part's not. But you're still starting with that presupposition, because I don't really know if the person I'm talking to, the interlocutor I have, is treating their theological position as a conclusion or as a presupposition, right?
Exactly.
Because obviously
Right.
there's presupposition out there, and that's really, there's a different way to approach each one. I think I know you well enough. You approach it from a conclusionary point of view. This is a position you have based upon your research, and you have concluded in your your studies and your expertise of it that God has existed, or God exists.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're not presupposing God exists. Am I incorrect in that?
That's correct.
Okay.
So and in fact,
it's a much fairer position, by the way. Much more fairer position.
I was gonna lay out how I've seen these scholars when they get into a room, or even when they write peer review journals and they write to each other and all that. What I've noticed is that, and in fact, the guest that you had on last night, I think it was,
He was very popular. Everybody liked him.
I have one of his papers that was in a scholarly monograph, which I told you about. He wrote it, and it was published in 2008 on Pauline studies. And when I was listening to it, I was like, yeah, this guy is, he's into Paul quite a bit. And I think his research topic, his PhD, is a very interesting topic title. And interestingly, when all this is discussed in an academic way, this notion of like, say if they were to conclude the paper, because I've done this, now you need to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's just you're discussing the data points, and any form of emotional feelings and conclusions that you have mentally should just be parked at the door, And it's kind of like the scientific method. When you come
Yeah,
into
no,
the
I
lab
agree.
and do
Academically speaking, absolutely.
you
Yes.
you any preconceived notions of what you feel should be the case. No, just let the data handle itself and just
But see, I'm
work
not
like
an
a scientist.
academic, right? And so I don't have the knowledge nor the experience, nor the patience to learn all that kind of stuff, right? I can't sit there and research to the level that these experts have researched. It'll never happen. So as
Yeah,
for myself, where do I go to go, okay, here's a plausible narrative of the account for Jesus's, divinity, not so much his existence, because again, I'm not a mythicist, but his divinity, or even still just God concept as a whole. I mean, when you're talking about theism and atheism, it could be any God, right? It doesn't matter. If you have a God belief of any kind, you are a theist. If you disbelieve that all gods exist, you say that you believe that none of them are not possible. None of them exist ontologically, you're an atheist. So it doesn't have to be the Christian God. Now, everybody in here, I think, obviously comes from the position that if God exists, it is the case it's the Christian God. But is that an argument from probability, or is that an argument from your just a faith-based thing?
Well,
it.
I don't think we. Oh, well, I was
Wait,
gonna say,
wait,
Go, go, go.
love the beard.
I don't think we can ever prove God to the degree that most people think we should or we can.
I would never ask for that,
It's
though. I don't use the word proof. I would never ask. Again, I said before, anybody goes into a discussion saying prove God exists or prove God does not exist is a waste of my time.
right.
I won't bother. It's just so unproductive.
Now, I think each person can come to their own, I guess, personal conclusion. And as you said earlier, some of those conclusions or some of those reasons for why they believe in God, they're very irrational. But then we have to deal with the rational or reasonable conclusions. And I think the best thing to do is to look at the Bible as you would any other ancient book, because most people they want to say it's divine or say it's supernatural. It really doesn't matter. You look at the Bible as any other ancient text. You look at the history of it, and I say if most of the accounts when it comes to the history are correct, look at the miracles, and like a really good example would be the Exodus, right? Most people would say, "Oh, the Exodus happened," right? And I'm not talking about the Woodards. I'm talking about the actual Egyptian Exodus, the people leaving Egypt. If you get evidence for that, and you get evidence like for some of those miraculous events that happen, like the water turned to blood or locusts flying around and stuff like that for a couple of days, then you have evidence this event happened. But you also have to deal with the mythic interpretation, which is the Israelites believed God was involved in that particular event happening. Now, it could be the case that God caused the locusts to fly around and stuff like that. We don't know. But once you have the evidence that this event occurred, now you have to make the decision as to whether or not God was in the details or not. So I think it all comes down to, different people are looking at the historical events and they're all coming up with either a mythic interpretation, which is the God belief, or an atheistic interpretation, which will leave you with, well, this just happened for happenstance. But as a Christian, when I look at those things, when I see evidence for these same quote unquote miraculous events over and over and over again, and you start off with God not being in the details, right? As you keep going on, you're like, you know what? We're getting evidence for all these miraculous events that these people recorded again and again and again. Maybe there's a God that caused this.
So I don't see it
So
that way, because just because there's historical record of certain historical events, which I agree probably did happen, that doesn't mean. And by the way, I mean even like the whole Exodus and the whole Red Sea and all that, different accounts from different perspectives, from different narratives, and over the years, each person that wrote into the Bible stories of that changed things a little bit, and so I don't think you have an accurate account. But again, when you have things like locusts, I mean, hang on a second. People thought bats were locusts, right? I mean, bats were birds, or they didn't know what these things were scientifically. They didn't have an understanding.
I'm agreeing. But I don't think that matters. I don't think the science or anything like that matters. What matters is, okay, do we have evidence for this historical event happening or not? Especially we talk about like the miraculous accounts, like or what they would consider to be miraculous at least.
Well, could the miracles just be they didn't understand what was going on? I mean, obviously you agree there was no global flood. I think that's a given. But
right.
To them, they that was their world. They Mesopotamia was their entire world. With the floodplains flooded, a local flood, and I've heard Robert argue this, quite a bit, especially with Aaron Ra, and I think Rob makes very good points on it. That there probably was local floods, and to them, their world was being flooded. It was a worldwide flood, and I think that obviously later on, young creationists took that and tried to translate it into the entire globe, the entire earth was flooded, which is just absurd beyond belief. But that was their understanding back then. I still don't see anything that gets you to God in the Bible. And by the way, does anybody here take the Bible to be a actual divine object? Because there are certain Christians I've seen that do place the Bible on a higher level. It's actually a divine, spiritual, powerful book, rather than just, like you said, a historical text, which I do think is the way to look at it. It is an amazing historical text, sure.
Go ahead, answer that.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, so with that, what the point I'm trying to make is, with that being the case, with the history and it being so well recorded, if the only thing that's missing, right, if you just take the evidence for the history alone, is the God interpretation. And so what I'm saying is,
recorded though. You had 60 different authors that are authoring the Bible that have different positions and different beliefs, and that were doing preamble type stuff. They were actually changing the story to fit things that have happened afterwards. They did it post hoc. How is that an accurate story?
You mean, so yeah, I don't. They may not have described every detail exactly how it happened, but I don't think that necessarily matters, because I don't hold it in like a Calvinistic type of inerrancy. So that's kind of irrelevant. But my point I'm trying to make is that once you establish the fact that this book is at least historically reliable in the points where it matters, then you work your way up to, okay, maybe the Jesus guy really did exist. Maybe he really, did do some type of things that they would consider to be miracles. And then you look at the resurrection account, where if something like that did happen, then you have to come to the conclusion either God had something to do with it or he didn't. And let's say the evidence leans in the favor that Jesus really did resurrect from the dead, but maybe, I don't know, it was some really rare medical condition or something like that. We find out how to explain it. Then you would have to pick between the mythic or the theist interpretation, or the agnostic interpretation, or the atheist interpretation. So,
well, I mean, if you look at probability, right, Wayne, prior observations, would you agree that every time that we have seen an event that we thought, we can't explain, either it remains unexplained or we have explained it by naturalistic means, right? We've learned more about our world where we said, okay, demons aren't causing, mental problems. They're not causing schizophrenia. They're not causing delusions. They are something physical, right? They're physical things that we know more about the brain state. So we can say, okay, well, that part of the narrative isn't true, right? When people cast out demons, I think that's not true. Right?
I think there definitely is a false dichotomy, and Christians have done a terrible job at this. And I think this started with Christians denying evolution, and they say it's one or the other. But how come in some cases it can't be both? I don't see why demons can't cause mental illnesses if you do believe in that type of thing.
Well, sure, also, yeah, of course, if you believe in them, sure.
Yeah, if you believe in that type of thing. But I also can't see why people can't accept the science that there are real mental illnesses, and people really do need real help from real doctors.
So how would you even differentiate? And if you have a mental illness, you don't go see a witch doctor. You don't go see a priest. You go see an actual doctor, right? I mean, I don't think anybody, to me, thinks it's rational to say, oh, you have a mental disorder, therefore you have demons. I think we've at a state, even our society now, that's no longer a rational approach to take. Now, in other societies around the world, they still hold to that, right? And they do some horrific things. I mean, who knows? Maybe even trypanning's still a thing where they drill a hole in your head. But I think that we are a much more civilized society. But you when you're taking these positions that these things are possible, okay, great. Yeah, they're not logically incoherent, right? I mean, there's a possibility, but when you see things over a period of time become more and more explained by naturalistic means, and as you said, that whole young earth kind of creationist narrative, it just doesn't work. And I love the fact that you brought up about evolution. When I see Christians try to convert people to their way of belief, and they're so adamant against evolution, it does nothing but destroy any credibility they have. It is the worst possible position to take for a Christian. It makes them look uneducated. It makes them look uninformed. It makes them look like they have no idea in the world about reality. It's an instant turnoff to anybody that has any kind of understanding or education. So if their goal is to convert people to Christ, they're doing a piss poor job of it.
Yeah.
If that's the approach they want to take.
I agree. But going to what you said about
I hop on the whole ambassadorship of if you're gonna believe this thing called the Logos, Jesus is the Logos who embodies truth and knowledge and so on, and then therefore you have to be pretty careful in how you justify things and what you believe and so on. So if you honestly don't know where you stand on, say, the evolution topic, well, the ignorance in regards to the topic should be based on the fact that you may not have studied or educated yourself in the topic. So therefore, don't make any rash conclusions that, or have some form of groupthink mindset after, say, Ken Ham's Ark Encounter that, that
but
evolution
they do.
is
A lot of them do.
Yeah.
And it's so sad to watch.
I'm trying to agree with you and
I know you do.
And mention to other Christians that me as a Christian, this is me sharing Steve's thoughts and also elaborating on the fact that I wish this was the case. I wish Christians would think like that.
Yeah, I agree with you more. If they want to have better discussions, the whole young creationist thing has got to go. It does nothing to help Christianity. All it does is help people like, con men like Coven and Ham make money. That's the only thing younger creationism does. It's so just unreal that in this day and age, people place such value on an ideology that you can actually go in, because we have the internet now, and check the sources. You can actually check the facts.
And now the next thing is flat Earth, which
that's the same thing. I mean, but you got to remember, flat Earth and Earth creationism kind of go hand in hand a little bit.
I bet what I'm going to say next, I don't want any flat earther to misquote me or misuse this, but Hugh Ross, he trolled Danny Faulkner and he trolled Ken Hovind in his debates with them. Both times he said that there's more evidence for the flat Earth than young Earth creationism.
I remember that.
So, yeah, but
I think that's
not to give
funny.
any credence to flat Earth. That's
no. I think it's kind of funny though, because there's a point to be made. They're both abysmally absurd. And if you're going to commit, if a young Earth creation comes at me and says, Steve, you have to believe young Earth creationism or you're going to hell, I'll be like, okay, well, I'm doomed. Because I mean, it's very simple that when people come after you to change your position and they tell you must believe that the way they believe or you suffer consequences, it's called argumentum ad baculum. And it literally does nothing to change my position. In fact, it's a major turnoff because of the entrenchment effect. And also, they got to remember, as an agnostic, I'm in the same boat as the atheist, according to some Christians, right? The atheist is condemned to hell. The non-believer is condemned to hell. Well, I'm a non-believer. I'm not an atheist, but I'm a non-believer. And so I'm in the same boat. I'm not concerned about it. I do not believe in that type of fiery hell that I'm being told, believe this or you're going to this fiery hell. No, I don't. If God exists, I don't believe that that's the kind of deity that would exist. I think that narrative was put in long after, in the Middle Ages, and you read Dante's Inferno. And I think Dr. Mattei agreed with this, that was not the original version of the afterlife. The original version of the afterlife was Sheol, and that you went there, martyrs went there, and you went there afterwards as some kind of I don't want to say, it wasn't really a punishment, but a continuation of some kind. I don't remember the word he used, but it wasn't like you were condemned for all eternity to burn in this lake of fire. I think that plays upon man's inherent fear of fire, which I think we all have from evolutionary reasons. We all have a natural fear of fire and being burned when it comes to that. You know, it doesn't mean like you're scared of fire, but you know, we all don't want to be burned, right? It's a horrible thing. So I think that
there are
played into that back when and used that as a technique to try to convert people.
I haven't listened to because I only just started listening to the first 20 minutes of that interview, but I'd like to look into any sources he has because I've looked into the hell topic or the Sheol topic, especially from Second Temple back. I mean, we're talking Qumran community back into the old, and concepts of Sheol having some form of not, I wouldn't say torment, like as if you're being punished, like you're in a jail cell and you're being punished for something, like you need to have some form of penance, you know, but more of a limbo situation of an existence that is without any form of physicality. There's no
But do
latitude
you
or
think that's
longitude.
temporary?
It could be temporary.
Right. So I mean, you're not you're not one of the Christians. Like, I mean, people in the live chat are like, Steve, you're going to hell. Okay, you're not one of those Christians that are like, oh, well, I'm going to condemn you for going to hell for not believing that the Earth is young. Because I mean, that's just a waste of my time. Because I know you well enough to know that you wouldn't.
I'd rather
I'm just throwing that out there.
pray that you come and become a Christian, Steve.
Well, yeah, but if I'm not going to hell, what's the point of becoming a Christian if God's going to potentially save me anyways?
I mean,
if interject?
Hell in itself is going to be thrown into the lake of fire anyway. So, I just 1 second, Howard. I just want to clarify something,
sure,
and then I'll let you go. What Wayne was saying a moment ago, I think is very important, which is what I was wanting to say as well, and that is, the emotional decision, the psychological decision to then go, you know what, there's something to this, and I want to join myself to this thing. That's why I emphasize this thing as known as like believing loyalty, where you become loyal to this method or this thought process. Now, and this is where you mentioned about me being the reason why I'm a theist is because it's part of the conclusion. So for me, when I look at the data, and when I also read scholars, and I have on my shelf, I have plenty of top Christian scholars that, like James K. Hoffmeyer is an Egyptologist, and yet he's an evangelical Egyptologist. So he specializes in the Egypt stuff, and he's a well-renowned Egyptologist, but he's a Christian, and then he uses that data to then accommodate the Exodus account and so on. The point is that when you read their material and how they function, and especially how me coming through university and being trained in the scientific method, you read the material as just dry data. You don't invest any form of emotions to it.
Sure, you do it objectively, and you do it in the way of the intent of the author.
Right. And so when I do that, the more data that accumulates and the more threads that connect, and really, I mean, if you see my Google Drive, it's just filled with stuff that I've collected, like scholarly material.
I've seen your Google Drive. Your Google Drive is
which, impressive. By the way, I'm going to be updating it with. I'm not kidding. With this figure, I'm going to be updating it with another 5,000 resources. That's going to, be
He's
uploaded.
Got a beautiful Google Drive. We all want to Google his Google Drive.
That when I look at these papers, and some of these authors are writing in the 70s, some of them are quite recent, like just last year, and there's all these threads that interconnect based on their methodological scientific method of investigation and so on, and it's critical. These are critical studies. That then, so with all this data at hand, I make the decision, going, you know what, this model of Christianity has a lot going for it, and I'm going to decide to put my stamp of approval, or to use the famous thing that people do, which is they put their name on the Bible itself, and they sign themselves to it, because the data is convincing to me. Now, is the data convincing to you? You might say no, but then this is where it comes back to that notion of, well, how are you investigating the research? Are you looking at purely mythical critical scholarship, like say the Richard Carriers of the world, or have you,
Well, I mean,
looked
I
at,
don't have
say,
the scholarly expertise they have. I have no training in textual criticism at all. Wouldn't even know where to begin. I only can read it as I
right,
read
but
as a
you look,
complete layperson.
for example, would you look at a Bart Ehrman? So Bart Ehrman would be an example of, say, New Testament textual criticism that would more or less align you towards a critical look at the Bible, and hence an atheistical look at the Bible, rather than, say, a Daniel Wallace, who is practically on par with Bart Ehrman intellectually. But Daniel Wallace would be the evangelical voice as to why you can trust the New Testament. So in this case, have you looked at a fair game? Have you
No,
kind of
I mean,
like,
not really. I mean, obviously, I've listened to them. I've read some of their things, obviously. But no, I haven't done my own because I don't have the skill set, and nor do I have the patience to do so. I'm a little bit apathetic on that. I have other things that I need to do rather than try to study the Bible. I have other people that study the Bible, and I listen to
right?
their arguments, and I prefer that method. I think that if you got a good argument, bring it to the table, and I think that some theists have decent ones, and I think some atheists have decent ones. And that's what I listen to. But when I hear somebody say like this, Robert, when I hear, people talk about younger creationism or something like that, and they say, well, if you don't believe the way I do, you don't believe younger creationism, you're going to hell. And I think to myself, if there's a God, and God is more willing to save people like Ken Hovind than he is myself, that God is a excuse my language, he's a dick. I mean, why would that particular God want to save a honest to God con man who has 48 counts against felony counts, who clearly is deceptive, clearly has no idea about science whatsoever, clearly has multiple claims against science that are so fundamentally wrong that anybody with a high school education, like a junior high or even grade school, can go validate that he's wrong? Why would God save that person, but not somebody like myself who lives a very decent, honorable, ethical life? That's what I like to know.
And you've heard me mention this to you before in private and maybe live, but I don't mind it. I don't mind saying this live as well. And that is, if we were to definitely put our, say, me and a few Christians in this room, if we were to put our Christian hats on and say, in the sense, minister to someone like Ken Hovind, and we know his faults and so on, we would ask him to repent, in the sense that he claims to be Christian, and going along with that statement, the benefit of the doubt sort of thing, we mention this to him and say, look, this is the problems we have, because then what you're doing really is not faithful to the gospel and to Christ's
but
name.
Yahweh is not his God. His God is money. Both of them are. They're con men.
But in light of what you're saying, God's decisions of who to save and so on, well, like I told you, I think there are many instances in the Bible. So, for example, Jesus in Luke 4, when after he reads the great Isaiah, well, he reads from Isaiah chapter 61, and he rolls up the scroll, and the entire congregation is full of Jews who believe in Yahweh and are loyal to him and so on. But Jesus, I guess you could say, he trolls them, but in a very important way.
Are you saying Jesus was the original troll?
Oh yeah,
Jesus was totally a troll.
he was definitely a troll.
He was the founding member of 4chan. You heard it here.
He brings up two examples from the Old Testament of two people who were Gentile. One was Naaman, and the other one was the widow in the story of Elijah, and says that those two people were closer to Yahweh than you guys. Now if you understand, and these people knew the Old Testament story of Naaman, especially. Naaman was some pagan from a totally different context, and with this loyalty he has for Yahweh, and suddenly his realization of who he should be worshiping and so on, it changes him. And so Jesus is highlighting the hypocrisy of the Pharisees in his day. And so in that sense, if we were to be a little bit more stern towards Ken Hovind and say, look, Jesus did say that there are those who come to me, Lord, Lord, did I not do this and that and so on. And then Jesus says, which I believe is the saddest words in the Bible, I never knew you. that is something, like, apart from my emotions that get the better of me in respect to young creationism, and I guess you could say when I've lost my temper with respect to Ken Hovind and Ken Ham and so on, at the end of the day, I will still put my Christian hat on and plead with Ken Hovind to not experience the sad words from Jesus. So, so when you, and I've seen this, Steve, I've seen you and some of the other atheists. In fact, I have atheist colleagues at my university that maintain a livelihood of utmost honesty and integrity that I wish some Christians had, in this case, Ken Hovind. So I don't believe God's going to, judge you and hate you and what, like I've told you this before, what you're modeling, ironically, what you're modeling is a life that Jesus demands of Christians. And so that's all I can say.
On that, Robert?
Go ahead.
Even the what is it, the parable of the Good Samaritan? The guy asks, like,
right,
who is the one who enters the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus shows, like, the two people who have the right propositions, the rabbi and or the Pharisee and the Levite. And they pass by this guy on the side of the road. And then the Samaritan comes along, which in context is like almost worse than a pagan because of his heretical Yahwistic beliefs in that time period. And he's like, this is the dude.
Yeah, the Samaritans were looked down upon back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I get that. And obviously I hear different people tell me different things. I only formulate my own opinions, right? I mean, if somebody says, hey, Steve, you're, let God judge you and, just lead a good life. Yeah, okay, fine. If somebody says, hey, look, don't believe young creationism, you're going to hell. Okay, right? It's just both of them, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, it's just water off my back, right? I can only go by what I know, what I believe, and my life, right? I try to be as ethical as possible. I have been that way since as long as I can remember. I remember my first story when I learned about ethics and honors. My sister and I was about 2 or 3. My sister is 3 years older than I, and my mom gave her a quarter and she gave me a dime. And we went to a store and I couldn't afford the chiclets or gum that I wanted. And I tried to steal them. Well, she made me go back and talk to the manager. And here I am, I remember, just crying my eyes out, scared to death. I'm like, I'm going to jail or whatever. It was a learning experience. And that was the foundation of me always being honest. I've, never stole a dime in any of my retail thing. I've worked in retail for 20 years. Maybe a few paper clips here and there. But, I believed in efficacy. Matter of fact, when people had ethical issues, they would come to me. I was in charge of a lot of that with customer service and dealing with these types of issues, how to resolve certain things. But, when God wants to say, okay, it is more important that you don't eat shellfish than you lead an ethical life. I try to wrap my head around that. Right. And I have to say, okay, what is more likely? Like the Levitical code came from God, or it came from some narrative that somebody interjected in it and said, you know what, here's God. I'm saying that God wants you to do this, because we have never discovered anything about God. I'm gonna take this pretty much directly from Ozzy here, if that's okay. That everything we know about God has been given to us by ascribing the attributes to God, just like you would any fictional character. And I'm not saying that God's fictional. I'm just using this as an analogy. So anybody listens in, this is an analogous here. So if we want to know about Superman, we look at the text and we say, okay, Superman has these properties. He can fly. He can have X-ray vision. Those were things given to him by man. We didn't discover that Superman could fly. And God's a lot of the same way. We've never discovered anything about God. Why is it God had something back then that we couldn't eat shellfish? What was the reasoning behind that? Well, who knows? You can't ask him. Well, so is it more likely that somebody just came up with that rather than there actually being a God up there that says, hey, you know what? I created all these shellfish. Don't eat them. It was more likely a shellfish maybe people got sick by it or something along those lines. And then they attributed that to God saying, you cannot do it. Isn't that a far more reasonable narrative?
Well, here's an attribute which no one thought of, and that would be the hypostasis of how the Trinity functions. And again,
the Trinity is one of the most confusing things on the planet. The Trinity is so confusing that you have so many different authors that are leading so much into you have mythicism, or excuse me, Mysterianism. You have all these different things of Trinity that makes no sense. You have three in one. It just, I don't think even the Council of Nicaea understood what was going on with this whole Trinity thing.
No, you'll be surprised. Athanasius he had the mental bandwidth to really.
Well, I don't have the mental bandwidth to understand the Trinity then, and I'm okay with that because it doesn't make much sense to me.
So. But what I'm trying to say is that, again, that's a good point that you made, that when we read about things that's taken place or written down in human history, and the keyword here is written down, for example, Superman or something, it is the construct of human imagination. Mm-hmm. So I think what Ozzy was trying to get at is, isn't it interesting that the Bible's included in that tradition of things that's being written down? And so
there's a similarity there, right? I mean, there's a similarity. Let's be honest. These things, the Bible itself is relating a very mythological story.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying the Bible's mythology, but it is mythologically.
No, I would use that word myths. I would agree. And even Hound would agree with that. Yeah.
I don't think that's too offensive.
But here's the crux. The crux is that if the biblical story, in this case, just say the Old Testament alone, just say we were living 2 centuries before Jesus and all that. This was definitely the type of discussion that was taking place amongst Jews of all people, especially nearing the Antiochus Epiphanes event just before the Maccabean revolt, and because God was silent and Israel was crashing down, and they've just come out of exile, and again it's going down. My question to Scientia, I don't know if you remember Scientia Perceptum.
Of course I know Scientia Perceptum.
Yeah.
Please.
I like that guy, but I haven't spoken to him in a while. Yeah.
Oh, I'm on Twitter with him all the time.
Oh, right. Well, let him know that I've been thinking of him still.
Okay, sure.
So when I first got on to Google Hangouts, this is back just before I met you, and Richard Bushy was the one that introduced me to Scientia. And I had a dialogue with Scientia on this notion of God's existence. And my question to him was, if God does exist, what's the most efficient means that he can reveal himself to us? And so my argument was that Jesus, in every aspect that you see in the New Testament, is those means, the embodiment of the Logos and so on. And then whatever he explains about himself and God and so on should then have a sense of transcendence that no man has thought about.
But I have no experience with Jesus, though. I mean,
no. I'm not saying about your relationship. I'm saying about the raw data in the text.
Okay. Because, like I said, I've had experiences. Not going to deny that. I cannot say for sure whether there's something beyond the natural, because again, I don't know what that means. I'm not, again, an ontological or philosophical naturalist, but that only gets you so far. I mean, there might be something more after death. There might be something more out there than we don't comprehend, whether it be a naturalistic or, again, supernaturalism. It might exist. But even if that's the case, nothing to me seems to go to God, or nothing seems to be going to Jesus, especially. I don't see a lot of that. It's just like a post hoc explanation of things.
But then it comes back to my question on, I guess let me when I say this, let me preface why I'm saying this, and maybe I can critique what I'm saying. So I'm critiquing myself in a way, but so it comes back to your approach. Okay, I wouldn't say your approach, or maybe it is more like what you're utilizing to then make a conclusion. So I guess then maybe
Well, I'm not making a conclusion. I want to make very clear. I'm talking as an atheist position per se, but I don't hold that particular position. I'm still agnostic, right? I mean, I'm still evaluating the proposition. I'm not moving my position.
Okay, so that's good then, because then at least you're being intellectually honest and saying, I haven't made a conclusion, because there's still
I don't know how much more intellectually honest I can be, and how much crap I get for being intellectually honest. Because it's so funny when I hear, and I get it more from atheists. But when I hear, you're an agnostic, and then I hear them say things like, well, atheism is just a lack of belief. I'm like, you don't realize you're actually logically saying the same thing. It's just a different name, but the positions are extremely similar. I lack a belief in the theist position as well. So it's just a name game at that point. It's semantics. But they mock me for holding that position when they hold the exact same position, only theirs is an epistemically, I think, unjustified position. I think they don't have a well-formed epistemic positions. I at least acknowledge that I don't believe the theist and I don't believe the atheist. And again, I'm using that as a philosophical atheism, the positive atheist. So I don't evaluate the proposition, but a weak atheist would just say, well, I don't believe a theist. And they never really address if they believe the hard atheist or not. It's hard pressed to get them to even acknowledge that their atheists have arguments for the non-existence of God. They are out there, and some of them are pretty decent. So.
Right. So, okay, let me just summarize, I guess, my reaction to what I'm hearing. My approach to the data. So, for example, take your guest last night when he spoke about something like 380 different contradictions, and then he clarified what he meant by contradiction, that it's not literally a problem, so to speak. It's just, it's this notion of how the JEDP hypothesis, it confirms, in his opinion, it confirms the JEDP hypothesis that you have multiple authors to just one book, like Deuteronomy or something. And so when you take his research and data points and his interpretations, and there's no denying, so he's not just some whack job. He's a legit scholar. He's credentialed in the field. He knows what he's talking about. When you take his data points and then say, if I take an equally credentialed scholar who would fit under the more conservative category, so one of my favorite would be Gleason Archer in the 20th century, and he was known as a classic anti-JEDP scholar. So he firmly believed in Mosaic authorship and so on. But the way he would argue about Mosaic authorship was that it is indeed, like he would argue it in a very scholarly way. He wouldn't say it in a wishful thinking way. When you take these data points and then you flesh out which one has the most weight, curiously, you have a lot of scholars that not only affirm an anti-JEDP hypothesis now than say back in the 80s, because in the 80s, a lot were holding on to it. Now the pendulum's swinging the other way.
Do you hold on to it?
No.
Really?
No, I don't. I mean, if again, I would have to nuance, because I would agree with him last night that there's certain anachronistic terms that appear here and there.
Would you agree that he was well educated?
Oh yeah, I would agree with that.
Because we had people in the audience, and there was somebody specifically. I'm not going to mention him right now. I'll tell you off air. But there was somebody that we both know that was extremely well educated that was not very impressed. And I'm like, what? Well, what is it about Dr. Dimati that you were disagreeing with? And I wasn't seeing anything specific. I think they were more attacking his. But this guy doesn't really know anything. And I'm like, well, he seems to know a lot to me, and I'm agreeing with him. He's making a persuasive argument. Right.
So what I'm getting at is, and this is not to boast, or this is not to put him down, your guest down, because this is part of academia. This is part of sharing of ideas and so on. And that is, there could be data points. So if your guest was, say, writing in 2008 on a topic, and especially in Pauline studies, there could be data points, say last month or 2 months ago, which is more recent, more up-to-date, more researched, and so on, that I may have come across independently in my pursuit of knowledge in this area, that would then go, wow, yeah, that is an outdated argument then. And so therefore I would like him to confirm with the latest in
well, we'll have to get you guys together. I think a discussion between you two would be absolutely fascinating. So we are getting in at close to 90 minutes though, and I don't know how long you want to keep this, 2 hours or less.
I don't mind. We can still keep it. I'm enjoying. The thing is, I
love this. I love you, man. You will always be one of my favorite theists of all time. You do know that, right? Like by far.
You're a good friend as well, yeah. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to appeal to you, Steve, in the same way that you appeal to when you are a science communicator, which you are an excellent science communicator. Like, you've done some pretty good stuff. I've seen you, for example, in the Bible thumping wingnut, show that one time for about 20 minutes. You just really,
You know what? That wasn't
everyone.
even a strong performance for me. I actually looked back. I've seen that video a few times. Scott of Fixture has it as P or called P or not P, and I realized I did make some minor, faux pas that I would have
Oh,
liked to have
you were
changed.
educating
But
them on evolution, actually, in front of Anthony's
oh, that
show.
video. Okay, I was talking about the one. I was talking about the tag argument. But yeah, the evolution
Right.
one. Oh yeah, they were. Wow, Console Google Plus, you guys, I hate to say it, but they do so much damage to Christianity, because I'm in the circles now, and I hear what's going on, and I got to tell
Right.
you, the atheist, when they hear the Council of Google Plus argumentation and the diehard Calvinistic approach, it just turns people off. That is one of the reasons, again, when I'm saying with people leaning more toward atheism, it's not just young earth creationism. It is that Calvinistic approach, the Calvinist mafia. You've seen it as well as I have, man.
Mm-hmm.
We've witnessed it in real time, and we look at each other and go, wow, this is really turning into a cult-like mentality, right?
But do you understand that how they would argue, and even when Jade was in the room, they'd use really outdated arguments against evolution.
Absolutely. Yes.
And Jade especially would be like at the forefront with the latest, like not even a few weeks old papers that she'd just link in the side chat and saying, hey, but check this out.
Exactly.
You see,
but that's why it's a turnoff, right? When I'm like, okay, well, people like, we want you to believe that God exists. Okay, well, if this is what you have to offer, people like Kent Hovind or the Council of Google Plus, you got to realize it not a good argument to convince me. Why would God bring those people, around?
What I'm getting at is that is the way. So, for example, evangelical scholars that are very good credentialed scholars in their respected fields. For example, when I spoke to Aaron Ra about Exodus, and I mentioned about James K. Hoffmeyer, Aaron Ra was just spouting what he heard from that woman that wrote about Moses being a myth, that Moses didn't exist. I forgot her name now, but she wrote a book in 2014, and I think he interviewed her on his channel, and then she passed away sadly, like a year later. But when I mentioned to Aaron Ra the context behind Exodus studies, that from the 90s onwards, well, actually from the early 1900s onwards, Exodus studies were non-existent because of this bias that critical scholars had after Wellhausen. So Wellhausen was the biblical scholar that introduced the JDP, and so therefore any form of Exodus study should just be done from a purely naturalistic historical context, exclude the Exodus narrative, and so therefore you're talking about 80 years worth of
Sure,
study
absolutely.
that did not even have an inkling of an idea what the Exodus narrative was getting at, and then only from the 80s onward did suddenly you have this reemergence of, hang on a second, certain loan words take place, certain key geographical places are mentioned in the Exodus story, which the irony is that we need the Exodus story to then confirm the Egyptology studies.
Well,
And so that's where,
still, even with the Exodus, there's hit or miss. I mean, there are people out there say that it didn't happen, right?
right. But what I'm saying is, these people who tell you that Moses didn't exist and this didn't, I'm saying, and I'm pretty sure other scholars would agree in this area, like I'm talking about conservative Christian, and why they're Christian to begin with is because of the evidence. So they would say that these people are like the Ken Hovinds. I mean, and I'm not saying that your guest last night was a Ken Hovind, definitely not.
No,
But that argumentation of having an outdated argument is most often than not the case. But otherwise, I'm not saying that all their arguments are outdated. Definitely not. In fact, a lot of their arguments still have a valid stay in the discussion. They still have a valid critique and a valid where we need to investigate further in these things. But otherwise, key statements that then make you get doubtful, and you start to, wrestle a little bit more. I'm saying, Steve, you need to actually look at the other side as well. See how the other side
I
tackles these
right,
issues.
right?
Yeah. So that's my appeal to you as well, because I know you're one for a lot of research, and I'm not saying, oh, Steve, you haven't done that, therefore you're not an honest guy, and no, it's just in part of this dialogue, I'm reminding you that some of the statements that have been made, I've definitely seen better arguments on the other side. Yeah,
sure. But does anybody have like questions for me? I know there's like two people in here that haven't really had a chance to speak, and we kind of spoke.
Maybe
earlier
Hound, if you wanna. Oh, Emily.
Or from the live chat.
Yeah. Let's see. Live chat's been busy.
Did Emily or
I'll just throw in my voice with General here that when you like see those really outdated argumentation, or like even for some cases, like for example with Carrier, there's one situation where he cites his sources, but he's not really treating his sources honestly.
Well, I mean, I hear that. I mean, you're talking about Carrier, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that, but he makes a compelling argument. I don't necessarily agree with him, but I don't have the expertise to really determine one way or another. But everybody that I've heard say, well, Richard Carrier is like the Ken Hovind of Christianity. He's like the mythicist version of atheism. Yet I don't see anybody really going one-on-one with him to really dive into it, except for Dr. Kenny Rhodes did, which was a good discussion. I think that Carrier did a really good job, honestly. But I don't have the background to really judge his scholarly studies. I mean, he's a PhD in it. He's a legit PhD in it. So I am not going to go saying, oh, Richard Carrier is somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. Because when I listen to him, he does make some convincing arguments. So if you think that he's wrong, the way to go about it is show that his convincing arguments are wrong and show that his Bayesian analysis is wrong. And I got to tell you, I don't see a lot of theists doing that. They just say, oh, well, Richard Carrier doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, well, show me why his Bayesian approach is incorrect. And I have read one thing that actually tried to do just that, which was pretty decent, but I don't see the average person knowing enough about his Bayesian approach to really go, okay, well, let me show you why Richard Carrier is wrong.
Right.
And I like to have the arguments.
Right. So when you look at Richard Carrier's argument, put aside the critical responses to those arguments, whether they're from atheist or Christian. To you personally, do you find them quite convincing, or do you find them interesting?
Not really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not convinced by mythicism, and I think it's kind of irrelevant.
Okay.
Now, granted, if Jesus didn't exist, I think everybody would agree Christianity is false, right? I mean, there's just no way around that.
If Jesus didn't exist, then you have no resurrection, and then you have no Christianity. That's true.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I don't know whether a person named Jesus exists or not. Like I said, I probably, but that's really not high on my agenda. I would rather get more information along the lines of which part of the Bible is that you should accept as historical record, which parts of the Bible should you accept as miracles that happened, and then what is just mythology and what is mythos, and especially what is metaphorical. Because obviously when I hear people try to put forth the narrative that the earth was flooded and there's a ship that had animals, and nobody in their right mind is going to accept that. It's just so bizarre. And I need to be able to look at the Bible and go, okay, if I was to accept the theist or Christian approach, I'm willing to look past that and say, okay, this was a story, and a lot of it was probably related to things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or at least narratives that people in that area had flood stories. That part, yeah, not true, but that was just to teach us some kind of lesson. But then I have to say, okay, well, what is God trying to teach by this? Why does God even have this in the Bible? If it's not the case, if it's not a historical account and it's not true, what is the lesson to be gained by having something in there that's going to confuse so many people and not allow them to be scientifically literate.
Mhm.
It seems kind of a contradiction to what God wants. If God wants to get people to get to the truth, then why would he put things in the Bible that are just so categorically wrong?
And again, I sympathize with that. And so my question, following from the prior question about that, the fact that you find, say, Carey's work interesting, would you then?
I didn't read his book. I'm not going to go. I didn't read his book. I just go by his arguments. And when I've talked to Carey offline. But
the point being that would you also say that, say, the arguments I put forward, in this case you brought up the flood, would you say that that's equally interesting from the other side, from the side that takes into these accounts
like
to be
your argument, like for the local flood, like you did with
right,
Arn?
and
Oh, I thought that'd be
Gulf
fascinating.
flooding,
And I got to
science.
tell you, and being objective, I don't think Arn was understanding what you were saying.
Right, but notice when I was presenting that model, I was using actual secular papers to
Yeah.
defend
No, I thought it was a
flooding
really good presentation you did.
Right.
Very, very excellent. But I don't, and I love Arn to death. Obviously, he's been very kind to our channel, but I don't think he had the skill set to. Yeah, I thought you had a good argument, sure, and I'm willing to accept that argument. That there probably was some kind of a local flood, sure.
But it's not just a local flood. That a lot of the details in the text actually confirm what the science actually is demonstrating.
Well, I get that, but you're relating that. Okay, there's something in the text that confirms scientifically that this flood happened, but that doesn't get you to this being some kind of miraculous thing with your God.
Oh yeah, I'd argue that it's not a supernatural event, that God it was definitely a natural disaster.
Right, and that's the difference. But then you're stuck in this quandary. Well, if it's not a supernatural event, then why have it in there? I mean, and what makes a supernatural event then? And that's fine, right? That's sure.
To answer your question about if it's not true, why is it in the text? But the text it's the only ancient Near Eastern text that confirms to the nth degree
the ark
the details.
Isn't true. There was no ark with animals in it. That part never happened.
But if you knew about my argument in my Noah's flood lecture, that the ark wouldn't have been the size of Ken Ham's ark.
Clearly, it may have been a rafter, like a little reed thing with a chicken trying to save himself.
And since Noah was a farmer, the Hebrew words connected with the type of animals he brings on would have been farm animals.
No, look at there might have been some basis for it. Like I said, some guy with a raft, going down the Sea of Reeds with a chicken trying to save his ass. Yeah, okay. And there's a story that but clearly that's not what the Bible's saying. The Bible is literally saying that animals came on board, 7 of one type and mating pairs and whatever.
Yeah.
And that's obviously I will never accept that because I know that's demonstrably not true.
Even if it's a few farm animals here and there, because it doesn't say how many.
That's a different story. Then you've scaled the story to be something to be completely than what the Bible's saying.
But I'm using the text to argue my point, and that is a localized flood, farm animals.
How big was the boat?
A mere yacht-sized boat that could fit maybe 1 or 2 cows.
That's a long way from the narrative of an ark that has populated 8.7 million extant species, right?
Oh yeah.
So it's a completely different story at that point then.
And the ark size, you see, this is how do I know it's the yacht size? Is because the dimensions given in the text is on base 60 mathematics, not base 10. And Ken Ham is using base 10 mathematics to make that.
And there might be a good argument for that. They might have used base 60 math. Very good argument for that. I think that might be even true. But that doesn't get you to the narrative of the Bible that the ark populated all life that we have today.
No, but it doesn't say that. That's the thing. So kol basar is the Hebrew meaning all flesh with respect to how many have died. And not only that, but with respect to how many come onto the ark. And in my flood research, I noticed that Job, the book of Job, funnily enough, in the creation account at the end of the book in chapter 38 onwards, it lists 10 species in Job's vicinity. Now, Job's vicinity was in Uz, which was where the Persian Gulf is located, but more west. And
Okay.
so therefore, in that region, the 10 species mentioned is not only confirmed to be within that region, but the agricultural farming that took place in the Persian Gulf just before the end of the last ice age would have been your ordinary farm animals
Okay, and
that
completely plausible. But again, if
that
all
fit
these
the
things are
Hebrew, that fit
naturalistic,
the Hebrew.
plausible explanations, then why believe there's a supernatural component?
So the supernatural component then would then associate itself with the phrase that happens just before the flood narrative, and that is the Apkallu Nephilim sons of God thing that takes place, and then God's like involvement with his relationship with Noah, and then leading up until Babel, which again, that ziggurat language of the gods coming down and intermingling with, and then
Yeah, the
finally
sons
he
of God saw the daughters of
intermingles
men
with,
with their fair and took them to be their
yeah.
wives, and these giants walked
But you
upon them.
see,
Nephilim.
I'm not
That's how we got
I'm not
Nephilim 3. Ugh.
I'm not basing my belief. Here's my point. All these data points, right up until the Qumran community, we're talking, if I was going to be literal here scientifically, we're talking 150,000 years of human history, if you think about it, because humans coming out of Africa and migrating into the Arabian Peninsula, that's 150,000 years ago, and you're talking that vast span of human history and involvement with each other and so on, that 2,000 years ago, you have, for the first time, supposedly, according to the text, a God himself tabernacling in human flesh in the person of Jesus. And so this is, again, coming back to my mention of scientia. What's the most efficient means, and what would be the evidence? And so my argument is that, yeah, you can make models that confirm with enough data points. Some other data points can be fuzzy, but there's enough data points to authenticate, which is what Wayne was getting at, authenticate the historicity of the biblical text. But again, you can't really um, argue for a God, that God's behind what's going on. And so it makes sense then that the only time in human history to defend a God idea, like literally, would be in the incarnation of Christ. And so if Jesus exists, and if he did what he did, and there is indeed a resurrection, and so then this is coming back to the start of this discussion when I asked you about, well, what if you were speaking with Paul himself from the New Testament, and Paul were to say, okay, Steve, uh, in light of these dry data points, just looking at it in a dry way, no emotions attached, how would you then, using the scientific method, how would you approach these data points? Because a lot of the data points point to God existing
Let's say
through
I would approach
Jesus.
it from a scientific method, but I don't think the data points point to that. Again, what are we looking at when we look at the historicity of the Bible? We're looking at 50 to 60 different people writing individual accounts based upon their own perspective and their own beliefs. And that's why I see so much discrepancy in the Bible, so many contradictions. Do you take the approach that it's best to take the narrative that Jesus was the Son of God, or the belief in God first?
For
Because
me, it's not.
when you talk about
Yeah.
atheism and theism, Jesus has nothing to do with atheism or theism, right? I
Yes.
mean,
So
let's be realistic. The
that's the thing. I
proposition
know.
is not a
That's the
God,
thing. I
and
don't.
you. Well, hang on. One person could argue
Yeah.
Jesus is God. I get that, but whether Jesus existed or not doesn't change the proposition of at least one God existing. I'm trying to evaluate the proposition of any God existing, not necessarily
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Judeo-Christian
Yeah.
God.
And you see, being a Christian for 9 years now, this is something I've noticed, and that's a very good question, by the way. And I've also asked the same question, and I've seen a lot of interactions even before we met. We're talking from 2010 onwards, where I've listened to the Unbelievable podcast by Justin Briley, where he's a radio show host that has atheist Christian dialogue. I've seen, when I was on Pal Talk before I came onto Google Hangouts, and when I would see debates with Muslims and Christians, because now here you're two theists that are totally opposing worldviews, And one thing I've noticed is that in all these dialogues, it's nothing but theoretical models proposed. Again, just using that science analogy and math analogy. These are theoretical models proposed, ranging from philosophy down to theology, and obviously down to the holy texts of various religions, to try and authenticate this God being, or disprove this God being. But one thing I have noticed that none of these people do, and none of these discussions involve, and that is this radical claim, which only appears in Christianity. No other religion, not even a Muslim, can defend Allah the way a Christian could if he was to go this route, and that is the actual incarnation of the Logos, that God himself literally comes down, and kind of like what atheists have been asking for many years. Like, I want God to.
Okay, then
be
why does he come? Why does he do it? Why does he come down to other people? Why is he just came down to the people back then? And why is it that the second coming has been predicted, falsified, predicted, falsified, predicted, falsified?
predicted by.
When does it get to the point where you just say, okay, he's probably not coming back? How many years in the future?
Before we get to that, the point is that would you agree with me that observation I had is an interesting observation, because that's the one question that they don't ask is, has God revealed himself in Christianity? And if so, in what way?
Odin used to come down and mingle with the people in flesh.
Who?
Odin.
But Odin's not the same characteristic as Yahweh.
Well, again, these characteristics are they're not derived by observation. They're derived by people ascribing them to God. That was my point initially.
Commutable attributes and
yeah.
Right. But do you understand where I'm getting at though? Like if I was a Muslim, my evidence to you would be Muhammad.
Mm-hmm.
And Allah. Now I'm in a harder position to prove that case because Muhammad is a mere man.
Mm-hmm.
But if Jesus is not a mere man, now you have tangibly in human history an actual discussion taking place between God and humans.
But that doesn't make one narrative either more right or wrong than the other. They're still both narratives, and the Muslim's going to defend his position with just as much fervor, if in some cases more. I mean, people that are Muslim will die for their ideology even more than a lot of Christians will. I mean, in martyrdom, the highest thing you can do is literally, give your life for Allah for a fatwa or whatever it is.
Right.
But I mean, that's just, to me, religious extremism. And that's another thing that, again, turns people away from religion. When you have these religious extremists like Muslims that are willing to commit atrocities in the name of their beliefs and of their Allah, which, again, Christians do as well, it does happen, then you got to look at it as, well, why does God want these people to be representations of believers for him? I mean, I am sorry, God's PR squad sucks. No offense to God, but I mean, if God exists in whatever form he exists in, he's got to be going, you know what? I would fire the vast majority if I could right now, because they're just horrible examples.
But that goes back again to when Jesus mentioned about, isn't it ironic and hypocritical of you that I appeal more, I have a better relationship with people that actually have never really associated with me than, say, with you yourself, sort of thing.
Sure, but that doesn't change the fact that these people still are horrible representations of what I would be seeing as a Christian. I'm sorry, but it's been getting worse, though, Robert. I'm telling you, it's been getting worse. I've seen it degrade over the periods of years that I've been on YouTube, that the radical evangelistic theists have taken a downward spiral that is just getting worse and worse and worse.
Mm-hmm. But I would say I would consider this the prophetic promise that Paul made in Ephesians, that the church then becomes the vehicle by which God's wisdom will constantly be unveiled I think that for the last 2,000 years, that has actually demonstrated itself to be
Okay.
true.
Well, then he needs to reveal it to me. Why is he revealing it to these nutters out there? Why is he revealing it to evangelists or just batshit? Right? That's what I'm saying. It's like, I'm the perfect candidate, right? I am the non-resistant non-believer.
What
I'm
I'm
the one that
saying
he
is
should be going, hey, Steve, check it, man. I'd be like, oh, cool. I would be like, I'm fine with that. Because look at when I hate this, because when I hear an atheist say, well, if God exists and he came down and said, hey, look, I'm here, I would tell him to piss off. I'm like, no, you wouldn't. You'd be scared off your ass. Let's be realistic here. This false bravado, not going to happen, right? So, I mean, I understand that people can think that God exists, he's a moral monster. I do understand that. But the reality is you'd be scared to death. And to think that you wouldn't, I just don't believe you.
The careful, thoughtful Christian scholar or thinker, I firmly believe there's lots of them, but they are either too introverted or they just don't have the time. Because at the end of the day, think about it. If these are thoughtful thinking people in general, usually they have professional lives that they can't be bothered.
You might be right.
And there's a lot of silent voices out there that are careful thinkers that I was surprised to. I thought here I'm thinking, am I really the only one, or maybe a few of me that actually exist? But no, the more I've interacted on the online context, there's
quite a few people like you. That's why I love your channel and I love what you do. You're the type of theist that is very respectful, very honest, very open, very educated. I mean, if all the theists were like you, there wouldn't be a battlefield that much. People would be live and let live. I think the reason why there's such a push for atheism among the atheist community is that they see these radical evangelicals. They see the encroachment of young earth creationism and these bizarre beliefs into our secular society, especially our schools. And even you and I would agree, we're both warriors against that. I mean, we're on the same exact page, regardless of our beliefs theologically or philosophically. We both agreed you don't teach piss poor pseudoscience in school.
Right. So but you see, just as I wouldn't say that, oh, I'm not an atheist because of, and these arguments have been made before, like you have those atheist politicians and leaders throughout history that have caused wars and so on, but at the same time there's a certain nuance in that language which these people don't realize, and so therefore they instantly label these positions of, like in this case, you're choosing to be agnostic but you're finding atheism a bit interesting, and therefore I'm not going to suddenly say Steve is going to become like a Hitler or something. No, that's ridiculous. So would you at least acknowledge then that the Christianity that's demonstrated by the clown Paul posse
they're horrible representations of Christianity.
That doesn't demonstrate the data points that, for example, I share or Hound would share.
Oh, apples and oranges. Yeah, apples and oranges.
So therefore,
sure,
your criticism of Christianity should act. Now, here's the crux. Your criticism of Christianity should actually be directed towards your criticism towards my data points, because who cares about the clown car posse's data points? Because they mean nothing. I mean, their behavior should reflect the data points. If it's genuine data points, they should have a specific behavior psychologically as well. Since they don't have that behavior, obviously then the data points are false.
No, I totally agree with you. I just think that your data points require a lot more in-depth evaluation, and rightly so. And that's why I'm much more willing to have a conversation, listen to a conversation, especially between you and somebody else talking about the data points, right? Because I'm only here to evaluate the arguments.
Right.
And so you present the evidence like you did with Arn and for the flood, which I think you did an exceptional job on. That's something that I enjoy listening to. I'm not saying do the work for me. I'm not saying, oh, well, Steve just wants to like sit back and nobody else do the work for him. No, but I mean, I'm at the age of my life and I'm at the point on YouTube where that's where I'm focusing. That's the whole point of the Non-Sequitur show, is to have these discussions and let people listen and evaluate. And again, not going to go down the route that just because we have flat earth discussions that we're like evaluating whether the earth is flat or not. No, earth is not flat. Deal with it. But I still like to hear the discussions of how people rationalize things like flat earth, and how a person who really knows the science can go, listen, dude, this is why the earth is not flat. Let me show you, right? I enjoy those conversations.
All right. So
Yeah.
since you have to go soon, let's spend the last 5 or 10 minutes reflecting on this discussion so far. And quickly, if
Sure.
anyone has any questions, like Hound or Emily, do you have any last 1 or 2 questions before we? Because I just want
I
to
actually
end at this
didn't
point.
have a question, but I did have an observation because
Yep, go ahead.
I was raised. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So I was actually raised in the Southern Baptist Church, very much steeped in the traditions and the definitions of evangelical terms and what have you, and came to a point in my life where I was ready to walk away from Christianity. And the only reason why I was able to return and have some kind of intellectual integrity about it was because I stopped defining the terms according to what I learned in tradition or according to how we do it today in our culture, and allowed the Bible to really define its own language. And in doing so, I found out that it is more cohesive and it makes much more intellectual sense than imposing our views today. If I hope I'm making sense of that, because
Oh, you do. Yeah, you are. No, you are. Absolutely.
And so that's actually what drove me back. I identify with a lot of what you were saying because I was there. I was to the point where forget Christianity. It didn't make any sense. God was this ugly monster. And if I had not returned to that viewpoint, and I had not decided to start picking apart the scripture, literally went back to school and did learn the Greek and Hebrew so that I could have these conversations. And a lot of the things that I'm hearing are a lot of the objections I had. And I learned that I had to rely on the expertise of people who'd proven their hearts by being dedicated and faithful to presenting information, not just an interpretation of the information.
And just quickly, based on that, now I know, Steve, you might be, and thanks, Emily, as well. But and from where Emily is coming from, I'm trying to relate that to Steve as well, but I know, Steve, where you're how you would respond, and that is, but you have Richard Carrier and you have these other people that are also credentialed in the field, and yet they're coming to an atheist position, or a really radical mythical position. But you see, this is where again I come back and say, but Steve, when you compare the data, so Richard Carrier is making an argument. I can give you good scholarly data that says the other thing, and when you put it all on the table, what actually comes out on top, what actually has the most scholarly consensus, and not only that, but the amount of data that accumulates to emphasize that this event is true or something, or verify something in the Bible, or ultimately Jesus existing and all that. It's highly in favor of that than
I think
say
that's
Richard
hitting
Carrier's
the nail
position.
on the head, though, of what we were trying to go for the Non-Sequitur show. If we had listened to you and Carrier talk about these specific topics, that would be absolutely fascinating, right? Because here's two people from looking at the data points and evaluating them. That's an honest dialogue. That's a dialectic that I will be thrilled to have something along that, because that's, again, two honest people. But real quick with what Emily was saying, I do understand what she was saying. When she was raised and I was Baptist, that they're looking very narrowly at the scriptures through a very filtered perception. I mean, I can never read the Bible the way a fundamentalist, a Baptist, an evangelical, or Calvinist could read it. It's just not possible. I just think it's bizarre, because science has already demonstrated that most of the things that they hold to be true are completely incorrect. The earth is not young. There was no global flood, that kind of stuff, right? So I think that when a lot of people leave young earth creationism, they take the theology with them and they just become atheists. It happens quite frequently. Now, there are exceptions. Obviously, Wayne, as we both know, left young earth creationism. A large part, I hate to say it, because of you and I think we had a huge influence on Wayne leaving young earth creationism, between your taking from a biblical approach, me having a debate with him on macroevolution. I think it was a multifaceted thing, but he didn't give up his faith, right? He didn't leave Christianity. So it is possible. And I, you know what? I respect Wayne for that. And a lot of people might throw shade on him for that, saying, well, look, you just left young earth creationism, but you haven't given up religious beliefs. So maybe not be an intellectually honest. Well, you know what? I think Wayne is being intellectually honest to himself. This is where he's at the present time, and he's made progress.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to know the truth. Tremendous progress from years ago.
In fact, for example, when Wayne was interacting with you just a moment ago, that Wayne is not the Wayne I knew when I was speaking with Scientia.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, Wayne and I used to have
Wayne of Scientia wouldn't
battles.
have interacted with you that
Yeah,
so he's made a lot of progress. Yeah.
I do have one quick question.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so we've discussed what will not change your mind. So what would change your mind? Well, I'm curious.
Yeah, that's excellent question. What would allow me to hold the belief that God exists? And I don't know if I have a ready answer to it, right? And I'm not trying to dodge the question by any stretch of the imagination.
I don't know, so it's a legitimate answer.
Yeah, I do think, I hate to bring in empiricism because I'm one of those people again that thinks that people overrate empiricism, and when they try to put science and philosophy, they're doing a disservice to both. But I have had experiences that, like, for example, like lucid dreaming, and I've had experiences with Ouija boards and other things of those lines. And I'm thinking to myself, look, if I've had experiences like that I can't explain, but I'm not going to go so far that they were supernatural, but just out of the ordinary, right? We'll call them either abnormal or anecdotal type stuff. That if God's allowing me to experience those things, why doesn't he just allow me to experience something that he knows would convince me? So whatever it is that will convince me to believe he exists, he already knows. So I just leave it up to him.
Exactly. I would agree with that. I mean, I would agree with that post being a Christian now. I would follow along with that line of thinking. But when I wasn't a Christian, I had no God interaction. Maybe I had, coming from India, maybe I had some form of spiritual, not to me personally, but I've seen with my own eyes. What you would say is something demonic. But what I'm trying to get at is, from my experience as to why I believe, is because of the dry data alone. That leaving out subjective thinking, bias, emotions. When people start to cry and they put their hands up, and
I don't buy any of that stuff. It's just not my thing. I don't, no Pentecostal thing. Yeah, not my.
What I will say is the only emotion I have had a genuine, heartfelt emotional response was when I came across, like, after we're talking a year into it, when I came across Jesus saying that his yoke is easy and light. Like, take my yoke upon you, and I'll give you rest. And if you're burdened in something, and I was, yeah, it was just one of those moments of what you could call like a spiritual awakening of, wow, this is something that I've never seen any other, quote unquote, religious teacher or prophet, communicate. But otherwise, just like when you go into a lab and you just crunch numbers, that's how I approach the text, and then I just make a decision whether I should believe what the text is saying is to be valid history or not. I mean, for example, if I was asked you to read something about Akhenaten, the pharaoh that James K. Hoffmeyer has written an excellent book in 2015. He released it on the origins of monotheism under this particular pharaoh. It's just dry information. There's nothing funny about it. There's nothing engaging, or there's no entertainment value behind it. It's just if you specialize in this area and this is what gets you going, you want to continue looking to this. So the average person on the street wouldn't even care what Hoffmeyer is writing, because that's Hoffmeyer's special area. But the point is that if you were to just look at it, just look at the text, and then Hoffmeyer goes, okay, would you agree? Would you believe that this particular pharaoh exists? And then you make the choice, yes or no. And then the choice comes down to researching that data point.
Sure, but it's a lot easier to believe provisionally that a pharaoh existed than somebody who's claiming the Son of God.
Actually, it's the other way around.
I don't see that at
there's a lot
all.
of
And again,
missing
these are all
oaths and
provisional.
pharaohs.
I will be the first to admit, all my beliefs are provisional. They're subject to change, right? I mean, you can't change beliefs, then
But that's good.
You're just a rock at that point. I mean, we
Exactly,
all have
yeah.
beliefs that should be. We should always evaluate our beliefs,
I
right?
agree.
And I'm constantly doing it all the time. And even though I have very staunch beliefs like flat Earth, I'm not reevaluating to the point where I'm saying, okay, is there a possibility the Earth is flat? No, there's no possibility. But I like to at least go, okay, if the Earth was flat, what would we expect? And it helps to increase my certitude that the Earth is not flat. Not that I really need it, but I think it doesn't matter. We all should do this epistemically, and we all should say, let's just look at our beliefs and evaluate them and reevaluate them. But I don't think it's easier to think that there's a being that to claim to be the son of God than it is to be a pharaoh, because objectively we've seen pharaohs exist. It's not that hard to believe that another pharaoh by a certain name that we think that may have existed. It's not a leap of faith because we have prior observations of pharaohs existing.
Well, actually, no, that's a whole different topic. But
all right, that's for another night.
We'll
wrap it up here.
Let's wrap it up. But you would agree that, say if there's enough information for Jesus to be the Son of God, that the emotional response comes much later than, say, as a presupposition that this is why you believe. So you would like the data points, and then the emotions take over much later.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, well, I'm a non-resistant non-believer. All he's got to do is convince me somehow. He knows how, and I'm not saying like a peer, but I can only go by what I see. And again, one of the reasons why we're having this discussion is I've seen such a disconnect between atheism and theist on the internet. There's a huge divide anymore, and it's become so much empty rhetoric, and I want to move away from that. You wanted to move away from that. We've had this discussion for lots of years. We know you and I are definitely in the same mindset.
Well, I was the one telling Christians how to behave.
But they were getting but they were getting on you for that, right?
Yeah,
you have been viciously attacked by Christians. I've been viciously attacked by atheists. It's like, okay, but yet both of us are saying the same thing. We want good conversations.
Yeah. Okay, Hound, any last comments?
Not really. I think you laid it out pretty well.
Okay. I don't think that's well.
And if people have any further questions, I mean, Robert's going to put my links in the video description afterwards. I sent it to him.
Okay, last minute questions in the live chat.
But you can go subscribe to me on my main channel, Steve McRae. You can subscribe to me on the NonSequitur show. And also we have the Great Debate Community channel that's on YouTube. And of course, the Great Debate Community, if you want to join that, the link will be in the video description. And, be part of these conversations, because we're definitely welcoming to people with different ideological, philosophical, scientific viewpoints. But again, you have to be able to argument or have an argumentation for your position. If you're somebody who thinks the Earth is flat and your entire argument is NASA's a conspiratorial group that's hiding the truth from you, you're just wasting our time. I don't have any interest in having discussions like that.
Especially Geranianism's debate
with
Aaron Ra. That was
all Geranianism did, and that's the second time we had Geranianism on, and I was done. I was like, Jaron, you are not presenting anything. I'm sorry. This is the same thing that I get on atheists for, and I've made the argument on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and I got a lot of crap for it. But I made the argument: look, if you're just going to sit there and say I don't believe the theist, and the theist has a burden of proof, and I'm just going to sit back and say you don't meet it, you're a waste of a theist time. And my recommendation to theists: if you run across an atheist, all they want to do is say I don't believe you, move on to something else. Find an atheist that says I believe God does not exist. Let me show you why, because they're going to give you a better argument. They're going to have something you're going to have a conversation with, and much more interesting to listen to. Because I don't want to sit there and have like a person like Robert, who I have the utmost respect for, give vast amounts of evidence that, or he believes, as evidence, something that at least a well-articulated argument. To have somebody on the other side just go, well, I don't believe you. That's not a discussion.
Yeah.
I want an atheist to go, hey, Robert, you're wrong. Well, I believe you're wrong. Let me show you the evidence to countering your position. Let me show you why I believe God does not exist and why I'm justified to make that statement, right? But anybody who just sits there and says, well, I'm not going to make any positive assertions, I'm just going to say that you're wrong and I don't believe you, what a waste of time that is.
Right. Okay. And again, Steve, but you're demonstrating Jesus when you say that, because Jesus,
You heard it
Jesus
here
asked,
today. I'm
Jesus
more
asked for
Christian
that
than
type
some
of
Christians on
hypothetical.
the internet. Thank you very much. I'm fine with that. And I appreciate that. It's very, very
Right.
sweet of you to say.
Okay, so to everyone viewing this, I put Steve's links in the video description. I put like 3 or 4 links, and definitely check out the Non-Sequitur show. And any upcoming discussions happening on that podcast?
We're having one today at 8 Eastern. It's going to be on Babylonian mythos and Sumerian mythos, and if these ancient civilizations had some kind of knowledge beyond their period of time.
Oh boy,
with Dr. Bowen. Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
Oh boy, who? Mind me? Can I ask who's defending
Yeah, Doctor. There's no. It's going to be it's kind of discussion we had last night. It's going to be just one person because he's new.
Okay.
We don't want to throw people into the Shark Tank right away, like Dr.
Wait, is it the same Bible scholar?
No. This guy's name's Dr. Bowman, I think.
Is he like an ancient aliens advocate or something?
I don't want to go that far.
Okay.
But I think, I mean, his paper, I read his PhD. Well, I didn't read his PhD paper. I tried to read it. It's way beyond my ability, but he did send it to us. And it's basically how the mythos, the Hindu and other cultures' mythos were able to like determine like how many planets are in the solar system before we discovered kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, that's legit stuff in there, you know. But if it's ancient alien stuff, then you just waste.
No, I don't think it's going that far. But I mean, I don't buy into the fact that they knew more about our solar system than we know now. I think it's post hoc. I think we know things now, like when the Dogma tribe on Sirius B and all that. That's after the fact stuff. I don't think these civilizations knew about Pluto and Neptune. I think that we looked at their stuff and said, "Oh, we're going to attribute it to that." But you know, I'm open to have him have his argument. I don't know much about him. This was Kyle's thing, and then we have on Monday, we have Rags, who is a huge internet gamer, 250,000 subs on YouTube. He's going to be on. He's going to be talking about Gamergate and SJW type stuff in games and overall. So, but I want to thank you, Robert, for inviting me. This was great. I wish obviously Hunter and Wayne could have stuck around longer, but I hope people can understand my position better. And if they want any more questions, they can message me and ask me via Facebook or G Plus or any links down below.
Yep.
And I look forward to that. I mean, I want people to understand where I'm coming from. So,
the person in the chat mentioned his first name, Jared. He says he love to ask questions, but he's actually a very good Facebook friend of mine, Steve.
I'll stay for one more question. If you have something, one more question to ask.
Well, I think knowing Jared, it'll be a lot more meaty and fleshed out. So basically, I'm just giving you a heads up that Jared is a Facebook friend that I can link you both up, and then you guys can, chat. So
yeah, that'd be fine, just fine. Your friends are my friends.
Yeah, well, not all 2,000 plus.
No, you got.
I don't know where they come from, but
you got a pretty good base. I mean, like I said, we just hit 5,000 subs on NonSequitur. My channel's about to hit 5,000 subs. So we're getting a base. We're getting there.
Right. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for sticking in. Thanks again, Steve. Again, one of my favorite non-Christians. Yeah, God bless everyone. And that's really it. Go sub Steve's work.
Thank you.
It's really top-notch stuff.
Thanks for the talk.